In Megillah, page 11b, where Yud Aleph Amud Bey is on the bottom, and so let's jump right in. We're mid conversation of how the 70 years went about, how they figured the 70 years of the decree that was told to the Jewish people and was known to the Gentiles, to the nations, that the exile of the first destruction of the first temple is going to be for a period of 70 years. The question is, how do we calculate those 70 years? When's the starting point, basically? And how do we count all the years? So let's see, we're middle of that conversation. So we learned about that so far that Belshazzar, who was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, took out the vessels of the temple at his calculation of 70 years, meaning what he counted as 70 years. We have basically two verses. We have a verse that tells us that from 70 years from Bavel. And we have a verse of Daniel that says 70 years from Churbas Yerushalayim. So Bavel means, Belshazzar understood that 70 years from Bavel means 70 years from when Bavel becomes an empire. So he counted from Bavel, so he counted the years that Nebuchadnezzar became king, and then he conquered Nineveh, which was Assyria, the great city of Assyria, which was his first conquer. Second year he conquered, he laid siege to, he conquered, Yerushalayim, because the northern kingdom was already under Assyria. And then there was the last three kings were all either sons or grandsons of Yahishiyo. So they had one king. The last four were actually, but the ones that we're counting is the last three, because the fourth one was already taken away by the Pharaoh of Mitzrayim, because there was basically a battle between Egypt and Babylonia, what's today modern day Iraq, between Egypt and Iraq. Israel's of course in the crossroads, because to get from Egypt to Macedonia to Iraq, Iran, is you have to go through Israel, or or you go all the way around. But that was the way they wanted to travel, and Yeshayahu didn't let them. And that's when the king Yeshayahu, who was the last righteous king properly, was killed. He already hid the main vessels of the temple, i.e., the ark, the special oil of anointment. So that was all hidden by Yeshayahu in his lifetime, and he's killed by the Egyptians. His son takes over, pays a tax to Egypt, and then he's dethroned by Bavel, and then Yehoiakim becomes the king. Yehoiakim is the third to last king. He's a horrible king. He's a king of a total 11 years. And hold on, let's let everyone in. He's a king of a total of 11 years, and he in his years of being king, Bavel comes and conquers. And then he rebels. He later is taken captive / dies, killed, doesn't get a Jewish burial. He's left to we learned about that in Sanhedrin, that he had Kfuras Chamor. He was like a donkey. He was left out into the field. His grandfather, Reb Safra, found his skull, so we studied about that. And in Sanhedrin, then they appoint Yehoiachin, who's also known as Yechaniah. He has two. He's known in the Megillah, he's mentioned. And why is he significant? Because he's the son of Yehoiakim. And when he's son for a few months, like we learned, Bavel takes, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Bavel, is told by his advisors it's a bad idea to crown the son, because he's just going to have vengeance. So he takes him to exile. With him comes the best of the Jewish people, meaning of the Mordechai is from that exile. With it comes part of the vessels of the temple. They appoint the uncle, King Tzidkiyahu. He's the last and final king of Yehuda, of the house of David. He again is a king for 11 years. He rebels against Nebuchadnezzar again, and that's when there's the destruction of the temple, and then there's the exile. So we have basically about 11 years, 22 years, or not 22 years we have, because not all the years of Yehoiakim he was under the rule of Babel. So Belshazzar knows about this prophecy. It's incredible, again, that you know about a prophecy that the Jewish people are going into exile. you would think that you don't want to get involved. When there's something going on between God and the Jewish people, or God and any people, you don't want to get involved. That's between God and the people. But Nebuchadnezzar is not scared. He gets involved. He gets punished. But Belshazzar, his grandson, calculates the 70 years, and when he finishes the 70 years, he says, "Oh, the prophecy didn't happen." So now he's no longer terrified to use the temple vessels again. This obsession with the temple and the Judaism, and just there's other vessels you could use. So he takes out the vessels of the temple on display because he's no longer scared. And that night he's captured. His kingdom is conquered by the Medes and the Persians. They joined forces. And Darius, the Mede, he's killed that night. Belshazzar, he becomes king. So he makes a miscalculation. Why? Because he says he counts from when Bavel became a power. So now, after what happened was basically we're going to see soon that the Medes were people and the Persians were people next to each other, neighboring countries, and they joined forces together to create eventually what was the first Persian Empire, because they went through different stages. This is the first Persian Empire, because then it was again conquered by Alexander, and then there was some sort of Persian Empire after Alexander. So he goes and he Achashveirosh, so the Medes and the Persians. Now Achashveirosh is a Persian king. So he now says, and we don't know exactly who Achashveirosh is, if he's just a commoner that became king, like we said before, or he's from the family of the king, but he was definitely not supposed to be the king. He marries Vashti, which is not uncommon even in today's day. We know that the queen Nora of Jordan is from Palestinian family, because the king of Jordan, most of his subjects are Palestinian, not Jordanian. So in order to appease the people, he married the Palestinian woman. So that's not something that's I'm sure it's love as well, but that's not an uncommon thing to make political marriages. So he marries Vashti. And Vashti is the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, and she always belittles Achashveirosh, saying he's a stable boy. Okay. So now Achashveirosh is king. And he also wants to. He's obsessed with the prophecy. He's obsessed with now between Achashveirosh and Darius, or Achashveirosh and Belshazzar and Bavel, it's King Koresh. And we're going to learn about King Koresh. King Koresh, the Jewish people have a very weird relationship with Koresh. Achashveirosh, the Gemara doesn't like. We learned that already. Achashveirosh, they call him a stupid king, and they're going to repeat it over and over again. If he did this was stupid, that was smart. So we find that there's a very, very, very strong mixed feelings. The Jewish people didn't misunderstand Achashveirosh's agenda, and those that didn't misunderstand that Achashveirosh was on board with Haman. He wasn't naive. He knew exactly. The only thing that happens is he wasn't. There was the Esther factor, or what have you. But he was definitely on board. Whether it was money reasons, financial reasons, or things don't change. So the economics and the politics of the time, he was on board with Haman. Koresh is considered a king that the Jewish people liked, also it's not so clear why. But Koresh himself doesn't really finish the job, but he allows the Jewish people to start building the temple, and that's stopped by Achashveirosh. So there's some sort of that's when Zerubbabel comes to Eretz Yisrael. That's the first aliyah in the second temple period. And Zerubbabel is from the house of David. So in theory, if that would have been a proper coming to the land, possibly it would have been reinstating of the Davidic kingdom. But it didn't happen. It came later after Achashveirosh with Ezra and Nehemiah. That was a different group of people. It wasn't the descendants of David. Yehoiachin, again, the king Yehoiachin he's the seed of David till today, because he's taken out of the pit, and he's given honor. He wasn't mistreated. Tzidkiyahu was, of course, blinded and murdered in front of his children were murdered in front of his eyes. Then they took his eyes out, so that's the last thing he should see. And he died of his molestations and abuse. Okay. So now Achashveirosh also knows about the prophecy of 70 years, also wants to take out the vessels. We're going to see soon it's not so clear what vessels he takes out, because some of the vessels went back with Koresh. When Koresh sent the first people to go back to Eretz Yisrael, which was again Zerubbabel, which we have prophecies about, we read about him on Hanukkah, and we know the story from Divrei Yamim. He goes back with the first group. They only built. We learned about they only built the foundation. They didn't have the temple. That was later. So that's when we learned about they put up the ark. They put up the mizbeach. So they put up the altar. They sent back some of the vessels with him. The theory is that the vessels that went with the first king came back in the first aliyah, and the vessels that were taken with Tzidkiyahu when the destruction, that went back with the second aliyah. Hey, Julie, and that was the vessels that Achashveirosh wanted to take out. Okay, so now Achashveirosh says, I also want to take out the vessels. Amr Ihu, he says, meaning Achashveirosh. Achashveirosh says, Ihu, Balshetzer, Mita Toi, he made a mistake. So you have to remember something else. What's incredible is, here's Persia's the empire of the time. I mean, maybe Egypt was a minor empire, but Persia was definitely the empire of that area, and over Yisrael for sure. And what does he understand? He doesn't say Mikri Ikra. What does the Rambam say? The Rambam says that the worst thing you could do is to say that bad things happen for no reason. That's just the way of the world. The Rambam says that's a horrible character, because you're not acknowledging Hashem runs the world. So here Achashveirosh also understands that. Achashveirosh knows.
Rabbi, I can't hear you. There's no audio. No audio.
Hold on.
There you are. Now it's back.
You hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
How long haven't you heard us?
It was probably just like maybe 15 seconds or so.
Oh, okay. I thought the whole class you didn't hear. Okay.
Oh, no. I would have said something.
I was wondering. Okay. Let's go. Hold on. Let's share the page again. Do you see the page? Is the page showing?
Yes, I see the page.
Okay. All right. So he says like this. So Achashveirosh says, so he acknowledges that the fact, why does Belshazzar get killed? Because Belshazzar took out the vessels. So he realizes that the vessels are the reason for being punished. But he says, Ihu Belshazzar mitatoi. He made a mistake in the calculation. I'm going to make the right calculation. It's not going to be a mistake. Michsiv, why? Because again, he opens up the prophecy of Yirmiyahu, and he says, Michsiv lemalchus Bavel. It doesn't say for when Bavel becomes king. Bavel. Maila Bavel, what does it mean, Bavel? He meant Legolas Bavel, from the exile to Babylonia. Again, it's here that all these anti-Semites and these nations are sitting there analyzing the text of the prophecy of Yirmiyahu to understand what they could do. And Achashveirosh understands that why is he punished? Because he didn't wait the 70 years. Again, a normal person would say this is if you're acknowledging that there's a punishment, you're acknowledging the 70 years, this should be areas you don't want to get near. But no, he's obsessed. He has to take out the temple, the vessels. So he says, so what do you have to make a calculation? You have to make a calculation when they went into exile. Kama Beit Sarin, how many years was there miscalculation from Belshazzar? Taimone, 8 years. Why? Because the first year he conquered Assyria, Nineveh. The second, this next 7 years of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, Yehoiakim was a puppet king. Then he rebelled, but for those 7 years, Yehoiakim was under Nebuchadnezzar. There was his last 7 years of his kingdom, and so there was no exile. So Chashiv v'Oyel Chalifayu. So he says, how many years? He calculated and inserted in their steed 1 year of Belshazzar. He puts in Chadad Belshazzar, 1 year of Belshazzar, because Belshazzar, we said that he had 2 years. So the last year he counted as another year. V'chomish to the Yavish v'Koresh, and he counted 5 years of combined between Darius and Cyrus. which were both the kings. Dariavish was the king of the Medes. Again, there was a joint kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. So Dariavish got the kingship first. He was a king for, I think, 1 year. Koresh was for 4 years or 2 years and 3 years. We'll see in a second. So that's 5 years. He counted 1 more year of Belshazzar, which is a questionable. Why did he count that year? Because he was killed at the end. But he counted a little bit of his kingdom. Again, he was pushing numbers. Vitarti Dide, and he counted his 2 years because it says when was the meal on the 3rd year. Hashivim, so then he said he has 70 years. He has 5, 6 of Belshazzar. 1 year from Belshazzar makes 6. 2 of his is 8 years. He fills the gap. He says, now surely the prophecy didn't happen. If the prophecy didn't happen, then it's all fair game. I can take out the vessels of the temple. Because he saw that there were 70 years and God didn't remember the Jewish people. He says, surely now they won't be redeemed. He took out again the vessels of the temple, when he used them for his, and you have to remember something else. We're going to learn something else. He also dressed himself up as a Kohen Gadol. He took the clothing of the high priest. There's a very famous, the Gemara talks about it later, but there's a very famous piece of the Kli Yakar and Parshas Tesava that talks about why he did that. It's complicated to creep into the mind of a person who knows there's a prophecy and then goes and tries to manipulate the numbers and thinks he's okay. I mean, it's above a regular person's pay grade. Okay. Satan, so what happened? The Satan came, Rikit Benem Vargas Vashti. He mixed into the whole story, and the outcome was Vashti was killed. So Vashti being killed was automatically a punishment, and although it helped the Jewish people, but that right away led, because he took out the vessels before the 70 years. We'll see why he made a mistake. That he says, okay, Rashi says that Belshazzar made a mistake. I'm going to make a proper calculation. Why? He says, I'm going to count from when Yehoiakim's son, which was taken a few months after he became king, right? We said Yehoiakim, then he put Yechoniah, then he exiled a big chunk of the Jewish people, so to say, the better of the Jewish people, they call in Yiddish the Besser mentioned. And that those people were the ones that were the foundation for Babylonia. And that was a chesed. It says God did a kindness to the Jewish people. By taking the first group of people, he was able to, when the major group came in for the destruction of the temple, they didn't come to land without institutions. The first group came in and set up institutions, so they were able to make the transition easier. Not easy, but easier. Kama Bitzin, so what was his calculation? Mishivas from the 70 years that Belshazzar made a mistake. So he says, Mishnah Shtaim le Belshazzar, Tamni Oisen Shmoine Shanim Shemalach Nebuchadnezzar of Neher Gelasai, as Yechonish Leihai Leil Belshazzar Moisen Manan. He says, what was the mistake? The mistake was again the Belshazzar. There was 8 years. Why? Because Belshazzar counted from the 8 years of Nebuchadnezzar before the Galus of Yechoniah. Before the exile of Yochai. Those 8 years were a mistake because you have to count from the Galus of Bavel, the exile of Bavel, not from when Bavel became a nation. So he counted 1 year, the 3rd year of Belshazzar, and he put these 8 years under the years of the miscalculation of Belshazzar. Chadid Belshazzar, the Hari Mishnah Shtaim Shalom Shivim Shana. So he was 3 years king. So Belshazzar counted 2 of his own years, meaning to say there was a partial year we're going to see. So he counted the partial year of Belshazzar as one of his 8 years that was a surplus. And he added the 5 years combined of the kingdom of Darius the Mede and Koresh the Persian. Again, the Medes and the Persian had an agreement. We learned before that Darius was 26 years a king of the Medes before. So he was just this last year, he became king over the kingdom, the general empire. Darius the Mede took over the kingdom. Daniel says this. And then Cyrus the first, he's the same Cyrus that gave permission to the Jewish people of Nea Goyla, the people of the diaspora. Lala used to go back to Israel, like it says, Koyamar Koresh, so said Koresh, from God gave me all the lands, and therefore go and build a temple. Again, we learned last week that Koresh prided himself on being a Moshel Bekipa, and he lied. He was an exaggerator. Why? Because the 7 nations he didn't have. He had 120, not 127. And the Gemara says you weren't a Moishel Bekipa because you didn't have all the nations. Because so the calculation is that they were together 5 years, meaning Darius and Cyrus, and therefore although we're going to later say that it was less than 5 years because they had a shorter period of time, their kingdoms overlapped. Okay. Retired to Achashveirosh because he made his party in the 3rd year. Kfar over time, and therefore he had 70 years. Okay, so that's the calculation of Achashveirosh. Achashveirosh says that in his 3rd year of kingdom is 70 years of the exile of Yechaniah, and therefore it's okay for him to take out the vessels of the temple. I think what we could say is, just a little bit to creep into the mind over here, it says is that you could say that maybe they thought that there was a prophecy. And maybe the Jews weren't worthy. That God made a prophecy, but the prophecy was that maybe they're going to be redeemed. But they weren't certain he was going to be redeemed. And they understood that their punishment and reward was based on if Hashem wanted. So they had some sort of acknowledgement of God. Even Koresh, when he says, God gave me all the lands, they had acknowledgement and they believed in the prophecy. Otherwise, they wouldn't even calculate the 70 years. And otherwise, Achashveirosh wouldn't think that Belshazzar was punished by God. Right, so they acknowledge these things. There's the Gemara. It's brought down in one of the commentaries in the Talmud of Kedushin that asks why only was Achashveirosh punished when he took out the vessels? Why wasn't he punished for wearing the garments of the high priest? So it's brought down. One of the reasons answered is that the garments itself. There's a few answers that we're going to see over the Gemara here, but one of the answers is that the garments, once they were taken to exile, they no longer had a holiness. The vessels retain their holiness, but the clothing they're no longer considered sanctified for the temple because they can't be used anymore once as garments. And again, garments are not. Also, some opinions, garments are not the same thing as they're a means of service, but the vessels are part of the service. Okay, the Kli Yakar says. One who's to open the Kli Yakar in Tetzava, based on some this Gemara and Gemara further down, that Achashveirosh was more obsessed with his party. And they also knew there's a tradition that at a party, when a person makes a Suda, there's an ayin hara. We know that there's a concept of ayin hara. I have a story of my grandfather, when he was a Holocaust survivor, and he made it out by himself with his 3 brothers. It was each man for themselves. He made it to Los Angeles. He had to start off his job as a kind person who gave jobs to the immigrants, and he was making ties. Eventually, he made a business and he bought a house. When he bought a house, the Rebbe would push him to buy a house. He wasn't interested in buying a house, but the Rebbe says you have to buy a house. So when he bought he wasn't a Chabad Chassid initially. He was from Hungarian background, but he became close to the Rebbe. So he bought his house later, at least 10, 15 years after. He came to America. So when he made his house, the Rebbe told him he should make a Chanukah Zabayis. He should make an opening, right? A house opening. It's a custom to make a party. And so the Rebbe told him that if you're going to be concerned for an iron hara, if you're going to be concerned for an evil eye, don't be concerned. So what you should do is you should have everyone speak. All the rabbis that come should speak, and when they speak, they're going to feel honored by speaking. So then there's not going to be an iron hara. But we see that there's a concept of an ayin hara by a party, by an event. And where do we see the first place that there's an ayin hara by an event is by Avram Avinu. Avram Avinu makes a party for his son when he turns 2. And it says, Vahi achar dvar me'ela, after these things. So the Rashi says, what are these things? He made a party, right away came a kitrug. The angel says, Avram is making a party. It became an ayin hara. What has he done for you lately? And then it ended up that God tested him with the sacrifice of his son. So we see that at the time, and Achashveirosh knew this. The Kli Yakar says that Achashveirosh knew that a big feast is going to bring an evil eye. So what did he do? He did everything he could to protect himself from the evil eye. And one of the things was he got dressed up as a Kohen Gadol. He figured that if he gets dressed up as the Kohen Gadol, that the garments of the Kohen Gadol are going to protect him of an evil eye. Again, we see this a little bit today. A lot of what's happening in the Megillah is what's happening today. You see, if you read what's going on in the world is becoming, once upon a time, was maybe not showing awareness to these things. They don't know what it is yet. So it's coming in a lot of negative energy. But there's a certain awareness that's coming back to spirituality that is being now misguided, but eventually it's going to lead to good things to the Mashiach. Okay. So Rav Steinsaltz says like this. The Ramban explains that the vessels of the temple were removed twice. At first, some of them were taken out during the exile of Yechaniah. Okay, and these were the vessels that Belshazzar used. So he used the vessels that were taken in the first exile. Later, after Cyrus allowed the Jews to return to the land and build the temple, which was stopped in middle, these vessels were returned. So the vessels that were taken with Yechaniah went back with Zerubbabel, the son of Yechaniah, grandson, great-grandson, that came back to build the second temple with Cyrus, but didn't end up happening, or at least not fully. Other vessels were taken during the exile of King Tzidkiyahu. Why? Of course, the temple was standing for 11 plus years, so they had vessels to do the service, and remained in the king's treasury even after Cyrus permitted the Jews to return. It was these vessels that Achashveirosh used, and these same vessels were later given to Ezra, the scribe, by the king to be returned to temple upon his return. Okay. So now the Gemara asks the question: what do you want? What do you want with Achashveirosh? What's interesting is that the Gemara saying that had the calculation been right, then he was right to take the vessels out. Why? Because the Gemara should have said, who says you could take the vessels out? 70 years, no 70 years. But the Gemara doesn't say that. The Gemara says, what do you want from Achashveirosh? You made a right calculation. The Gemara says, no, he did make a mistake. Because you're not supposed to count from the first exile of Yechaniah. You have to count from the destruction of Jerusalem, which happened 11 years later. Meaning to say, Yechaniah started the exile, but King Tzidkiyahu was a king, and this temple was standing. Okay, so we find this is, one of the biggest things that started from Yaakov Avinu, right? It says Yaakov Avinu is on his deathbed, and he calls in his sons. So Rashi says he comes in to tell them the end of days. Because the God says, okay, so he wants to tell them the end of days. And God takes it away from him. He doesn't say it, so he says other things. He gives them blessings. And in the blessings, he talks about the end of days, and Bilam talks about the end of days, about Yehuda and Mashiach. We see that the idea of trying to figure out the days has been something with the Jewish people from when we became a nation. Chishav v'saketz, all the Kitzim, all the Rashi had one, and the Rambam had one. But all the way, the last Kates that I know of was the last end of days calculations from the Alter Rebbe. I mean, maybe there's a later one, but the one that we had was in 2075, so 11 years ago. 11 years ago was the last Kates that I know of the end of days from the Alter Rebbe, 5,775. So he made a right calculation. So he also made a mistake. Why? He should have counted from the destruction of the temple. Rashi says, goes Tzidkiyahu, from when Tzidkiyahu, the uncle of Yechaniah, who's the last king, and he remained for another 11 years, for a year, because that's when the city was burnt. In Daniel, it says the destruction. Again, we have two verses. One verse says Bavel, and Belshazzar thought when Bavel became a nation. Achashveirosh thought when the Jewish people went to Bavel, went to exile. And then we have Charvus Yerushalayim, we have the destruction of Jerusalem. He should have counted from then. That 70 years from the destruction of the temple. He ignored that verse and he went with the verse of the first exile. So again, he made a mistake. Again, from the Gemara's mashma, the Gemara, it seems that had he not making a mistake, he wouldn't have been punished. So the Gemara continues, safe, kama beitzarim, 1 second. How many years are missing in his calculation? Chadasar is only 11 years. Iyu kama malach, but how many years was he king? He was king Arbasar, he was king 14 years. So Achashveirosh was king 14 years. So what happened? Wasn't the temple built in his days? If he only miscalculated by 11 years, and he had in his final year, he should have built the temple should have been built, and there should have been a return of the exile. Allah machsiv, and it says, Beidayin b'telas avidas beis aliyah di Yerushalayim. So he brings down that it says in Ezra. So it says, then the work of the house of God, which is in Jerusalem, ceased. So it ceased until the second year of the reign of Darius, the king of Persia. So there's two Darius. There's Darius, the king of the Medes, and Darius, the son of Esther, according to most opinions. So it only happened in the second year of his kingdom, not in the final year of Achashveirosh. Amarav Shanim Mikutayis Hayu. They had half years. Both Belshazzar and Achashveirosh were being, they didn't have patience. So they were counting partial years. You have to remember something else. There's also this Mishnayos. When do kings start counting? A Jewish king starts counting the years from Nisan. A Gentile king starts counting its years from, for instance, if a Jewish king is appointed king in the last week of Adar, and that's brought down. And then we learned this in Rosh Hashanah, right? And then comes Chodesh Nisan. So they start counting the second year of his kingdom, even though he's only a king for a week, because after the Rosh Chodesh Nisan comes, so that's when you start counting again. So by Gentile kings, we count from Tishrei, from Rosh Hashanah, because they go with the creation of the world, of the physical world, not the creation of, not the Chodesh Lachem. Jewish people go with the months, and that's the first month is the month of Nisan. That's only Lachem. That's only for the Jewish people. But for the nations, the first of the month starts Tishrei, not the New Year's on January 1st. But so therefore, when's the new kings come into kingdom? On the first of Tishrei. So there's a lot of partial years there. Shana Mukutayis, he says they were partial years, and they counted them as full years. So Rashi says, "Shekach Omen Abayis Achagos Yechania." 11 years it stood after Yechani was exiled. The house stood for another 11 years, and those were the 11 years that Tzidkiyahu was king. He was king 14 years. So when did it's funny? Achashveirosh is king only 14 years. The story of Purim happens at the end of his kingdom. Why? Because on the 12th year is when they did the Pur, which is interesting. The Megillah starts from the third year of his kingdom, or when he became king. The story of the feast is in the third year. That's when we're going to learn in a few minutes is when the Gezerah happened, or when the Gezerah kicked in, when they sat there at the meal. But that from the third year until the 12th year, Haman only becomes the viceroy. Things only get ugly in the 12th year of his kingdom. When did he do the pool? When did he do the pour? When did he do the draw? It was on the 12th year of Achashveirosh. And it was a whole year of the story of Purim. And like he says, when do kings start a new year on Rosh Hashanah? Tishrei. So the poor was in Adar, comes Rosh Hashanah. So Minyanim v'nischacha Hashanah b'Tishrei, and the new year starts on Tishrei. V'chsiv l'shana cheres l'kayim v'sigeres Purim mazos hashenis har yudal. So what happened? It seems like when the Megillah finishes, Achashveirosh finishes, because the Megillah we're going to learn finishes really in the second year. The first year, Esther and Mordechai, we said, sent out the message they should keep Purim. L'shana cheres the next year, they wanted to make sure that it wasn't a 1 year holiday. So the Shana Cheres the next year, they said, make sure that Purim is an established holiday. It means for years to come. I could say later, even Mashiach's times, we're going to have Purim. And after that, Achashveirosh is no longer king, so he's king 14 years. So he says, make Korish betilas avedas beis alekash etziva Korish livneis v'chazer by aidei tzar Yehuda v'Binyamin. The house that Korish said to build stopped being built. So says Ezra. Why? Because the enemies of the Jewish people, meaning Yehuda and Binyamin were the two tribes of the south. Sefer Ezra, as it says in the book of Ezra, until the second year of Darius the second. He was only king. He was king after Achashveirosh. And this king was called three names. What are the three names that he was called? He was called Darius. He was called Koresh, also Cyrus. And he was called Arsachshasta. So those are the three names of Esther's son who becomes king, and he's the one who allows the Jewish people to build the temple. So the Gemara answers, Rava says, Shanim Mikutayis. They were half years. Oisen Shanim Shemaninon, Lamayli Yesh Bem Shenivlu Mishal Achron. It wasn't exactly 12 months each king, so they went into each other. Barishan Kikoin, he gives an example. The Rais Amadi, the Rais the Mede, which is the first of the Persian Mede king, the one who took over after the Babylonians, after Belshazzar, who conquered. Vikoresh and Koresh, the second king, Sheminyan lehem hey shana, that we counted 5 years for them. Laitim tzaladalit. That's really only 4 years. Dechsiv b'shana achas dayavish ben Achashveirosh. This Rayis ben Achashveirosh is not the Achashveirosh of our Megillah. So this is the Rayis of Achashveirosh the first, and he's the Rayis the Mede who took over after the Babylonians. The Sefer Daniel b'shnas shalosh l'machas Koresh, which was the third of the king of Koresh. V'tanya b'seder olam, we learned in Seder olam. Seder olam is like a medrash that counts all the years together of what happened in the span of time. That the Medes didn't have more than a year. So they only were king for 1 year, the Medes, and afterwards the Persians took over, and it became the Persian Empire. Not that there was a war, but they had an agreement, and the agreement was one would be kings, the other would have ministers. That's why in the Megillah it goes Madai Paras, Paras Madai, because they were a joint effort, but really the Medes were only king for 1 year. Well, he was only king for 3 years. So says in the book of Daniel, in the third year of Koresh. We also learn he also wasn't king full 3 years. He had partial years, a little bit from here, a little bit from there. So he says, so there's 1 year lacking in the 5 years of Darius and Koresh, and also Nebuchadnezzar, the first king of Babel, and evil Morach, his son, also weren't complete years. So if you take that year, a surplus of a year in the kingdom of Babel between Nebuchadnezzar and evil Marduk, and you take a year between Darius and Cyrus, you have 2 years, and those 2 years are after the years of Achashveirosh. So that's therefore in the second year of Darius the second, the Persian, the son of Esther, that's why the temple is built, and then you have exactly 70 years. Okay, so he makes a mistake. Again, had he not made a mistake, it seems like he would be on the clear. Also, Gemara continues, we learned, so it says that there was 1 more year. He says, there's 1 more year. It's brought down in that of a mixture in the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar, the father, and Evil Marach, the son. That wasn't 2 separate years; it was 1 year kind of combined, and they counted them as 2 years, so they had a surplus of a year. He says, "Oichan acheres lebav." Rashi says, "Hachi iser b'seider olam." Baby Lila kotel Bashetzer. Bashetzer was killed that same night, right? He took out the temple vessels. He was killed that same night. That's why the scholars are again. The story was told, right? They're at the party. It wasn't like just a story, he had a heart attack. The story, they're at the party and they see the hand of fire writing on the wall. And that's the expression, writing on the wall. And Daniel says, you're going to be punished. You took out the temples of the vessels of the temple. That same night he was killed. Everyone knew that. So they knew that it was a part of the prophecy. Malchad Ariyavish, and then he came, Moda, the Rayis, the Mede, became king. Kib Malchusa, Harishivim Shanim Yom Shemalchnu V'Nechzer, Shivim Chaser Achas Miyem Shekivish Yayakum. If you count V'Oid Shana Achas Lebavel Lemali Shivim Shana Mishishalat Al Yisrael V'Omed Daryavish V'Shlimoi V'Achrav B'Shnas Acheres Malach Koirish Mibavel V'Niftu B'Kida B'Miktzas Shamer Mi B'Chem. Okay, so he goes like this. Oichan Acheres Lebavel, meaning Hachi Yisrael B'Sei Darlam Baby Laila Kotel Bashetzer. The same night that Bashetzer was killed, Malka Daryavish Mida, the Rayis the Mede became king. Kib Machusa, and he took over the kingdom. As Harishivim Shana Miyayim Shemalch Nebuchadnezzar. So that's a complete 70 years from when Nebuchadnezzar was king. Shivim Chaser Achas Miyayim Shekivish Yayakum. It's 69 years from when Yayakum was king, because there was 1 year. It was only in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's rule did he go into Yerushalayim. He didn't destroy Jerusalem, but he conquered it. And so there's another year till there's 70 years Mishashal Yisrael from when they ruled the Jewish people. And then the Rayis came and made up of that year. So therefore they had a complete 70 years from when the Jewish people were conquered initially. Not even exiled, not destroyed, but conquered. And the next year Cyrus became king. So they weren't totally off. Why? Because it really was 70 years after Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem 7 years before he destroyed, before he conquered, before he exiled Yechaniah, there was some sort of geula. It's called nifkadu pekida b'miktzas. There was a little bit of a remembrance. I mean, God sent back. That's when the first aliyah happened. Sha'amar, that Cyrus said, "Mi b'chem mikol amay." Who are the people, the Jewish people? You could go up to Jerusalem. So there was some sort of 70 years. It wasn't these guys weren't totally off, because the 70 years, after 70 years of the first time a Bavel went into Jerusalem, there was some aliyah. They put up the markings of the temple. They put up they had some sort of rule of Zerubbabel. He was from the descendant of the king. They put up the altar. So what do we see clearly? That when Cyrus let the Jewish people go back was a complete 70 years. Belshazzar took out the vessels a year before. What does it mean? But we counted 70 years. How does it come to 69 years? Because we were counting half years. Okay. The Gemara continues. Amar Rava. Rava says, and this is a fascinating statement. Af Daniel Tov b'hai chushbana. It's not just that the Gentile kings were making mistakes. Daniel, the great Daniel, was the visionary. He wasn't a prophet. He was a visionary. He was a chizar. He also made a miscalculation. Ani Daniel binoisi b'sfarim. He's sitting there analyzing the books. When's the date? Means why did he have to look at the books? Because he made a mistake. He made a miscalculation. Again, it's not just dates. Very, very strong. The very fact, the Rebbe always spoke about this, the very fact that Yaakov, our forefather, wanted to tell the Jewish people, his sons, and this would be, he knew it wouldn't be just to them, it would be a tradition. When is the end of days? Means that the knowing the end date is an important concept. Daniel wants to figure out, Yirmiyahu says that Achashveirosh wants to figure out, everyone's trying to figure out these dates. Till today, we're trying to figure out the dates, but there's a concept here. There's a concept of wanting to know the end of days. My grandfather told me, I don't know if this is the idea at all. My grandfather told me, and again, he was in the Holocaust, and he was initially in Auschwitz, and then he went to a labor camp. He told me the only thing that kept him alive was at one point, it was Rosh Hashanah, I think. It was a good few months before the end of the war. But a German soldier looked at him and he saw him mamish like dying under the weight of the labor. And he says, Yingala, he spoke to him in Yiddish. My grandfather was 18. Don't worry, they're making an agreement that there's a ceasefire and it's going to end soon. That's what the German soldier told my grandfather. He says, if he wouldn't have told him that, he wouldn't have survived. When he heard that it's over, like they're not going every day without seeing an end. How could you continue? When the German soldier told him they signed the ceasefire and it's going to end soon, he was able to survive, because otherwise there's no way I would have survived. So there's a concept of knowing an end of something. And so Yirmiyahu also, Daniel also, binoisi b'sfarim, lashon sfir v'cheshbon. He went into to figure out that the word b'sfarim also means from the word mispar, the numbers. He was trying to check the numbers. He was one scratch. It was a head scratcher for him. We know what's going on. It's 70 years. And again, it was a teaser also. This comes back, I don't want to get into politics, but this comes back also to what's happening now with the Zionism and what happened in 1948 with the state of Eretz Yisrael, where people are saying, Aschalta de Gula, not Aschalta de Gula, is the beginning of redemption, not redemption. But these things happened before. Koresh came and let the Jewish people back, and it was 70 years after. And it was not, those 70 years were significant because they miscalculated before. So Belshazzar was off by a year in a certain concept. So we call Mokim, Kashu Kraya Dadi, because we have two verses that are confusing. One says Melois LeBavel, 70 years from when whatever Melois Bavel is, Belshazzar thought it meant from when Bavel becomes a people. Achashveirosh understood it meant from the first exile of Bavel, and then we have a verse that says Charvis Yerushalayim, the destruction of Israel, of Jerusalem. I mean, if you were asking, if I was the one studying the numbers, that would be to me the obvious. It says Charvis Yerushalayim, from the destruction of Israel, of Yerushalayim. But you could also call it Charvis Yerushalayim to mean not the total destruction of Yerushalayim, but to be the first exile could also be a churban, right? A destruction. One pasuk says when 70 years from when Bavel becomes full, they understood to mean either a nation or the first exile. That said, after 70 years, I'm going to remember you. After the destruction of Jerusalem, 70 years. These are the 70 years that God spoke to Yirmiyahu. So Amar Rava says the Bekida Ba'alma. That this two contradictory psukim, one says 70 years from Bavel, and one says the destruction of Jerusalem, is stages. That he says the Bekida Ba'alma, that he's going to be remembered. And they were remembered. They went back with Zerubbabel. But that's not the full redemption. And this is what Koresh put out an edict. Melech Paras, the king of Persia, all the lands of the earth God gave me. Right? Boasting. That's why today people like to attribute certain world leaders to Koresh. Because that kind of personality is Koresh. And God told me it's time to build a house in Jerusalem. So Koresh took it upon himself the responsibility to allow the Jewish people to go back to Yerushalayim to build a temple. And he himself says, I've been appointed by God to do so. Right? I'm a messenger of God. The Bekida Ba'alma, so the Rashi says, but it's just a remembering. It wasn't a full redemption. And that's the first verse. That after Bavel, meaning, and it was right, so Belshazzar wasn't totally wrong. If you can account from when Bavel became a people, from when they conquered Yechania at least, you have the 70 years. In the first year of Cyrus, because there were Shanim Uktais, the years weren't full, Koresh became king, and she Shnas Ayin Aleph, the Kivush Yakim should push the Bavel al Yisrael. From when Bavel conquered Jerusalem, there was, even though he didn't destroy the temple, Koresh did let the Jewish people go back. And he said, God appointed me to build a temple. So here we have a very interesting Gemara. The Gemara says, Darash Rav Nachman, Bar Rav Yitzchak. And Rav Nachman, the son of Rabbi Yitzchak, says as follows. He says, this is a hard Gemara. My dechsiv, what does it mean in the verse of Yeshaya 45:1? There's a whole prophecy. Again, Yeshaya lives in the time of Chizkiyahu, right? He lives all the way before Bavel was a people, when they were dealing with Sancheriv, with the Assyrian army. So he says a prophecy as follows. Koi Amar Hashem leMashiachai, so said God to his anointed one, the Koresh to Cyrus, Asher Echzakti b'minai, I held on to his right hand. So seemingly the verse is saying that God is calling Koresh the Mashiach, right? How many people came up and after 2016, 2022, 24, calling certain people Mashiach, right? So there's a verse that Koresh, who's a Gentile, king of the world, is called Mashiach. The Mashiach the Koresh, the my anointed one, Koresh. Koresh Mashiach, was Koresh Mashiach. Now, over here the Gemara doesn't mean Mashiach the way we understand it to mean Mashiach, the Savior. Mashiach means actually the anointed one. So you want to say that Koresh is the anointed one? God is not talking about Koresh the Mashiach, but he's talking to the Mashiach about Koresh. I regret, I'm disappointed in Koresh. I said that he should build the temple. And he should gather in the exiles. He just gave an edict for the Jews to do it on their own. He just said, he's trying to take credit for something he didn't do. He said, God gave me all the nations and he made me build a temple. Go up and do it. God tells the Mashiach, I didn't tell him to tell others to do it. He should go do it. He should build a temple. It's brought down in Sfarim that had he done it, there never would have been a destruction of the second temple. This was a Mashiach moment. It was a Mashiach moment. That's why a lot of the commentaries ask, the Ben Yehuda asks, Ben Ishchai, why is God talking to Mashiach about Koresh? Why is it important to Koresh? One of the things is, the reason why the Gemara asks, was Korach a Mashiach, was literally, technically, he wasn't anointed. we have the Mashiach means the anointed one. We have the Shemin HaMishcha, the special oil of anointing. That oil was used for kings. King David, Solomon, other kings were used with anointing oil. They also had Gentile kings that were anointed by different prophets. Eliyahu Navi anointed the king of Aram. So even Gentile kings had anointing. Koresh wasn't one of them, so that's why technically he was an anointed one. But also in the general picture, what we know as the Mashiach. So the Ben Yehuda says, "Amai heve Kadosh Baruch Hu dinish hakoresh of the Mashiach tafka." So we don't have the answer, but basically the Ben Yochai is saying, why is God B'chlal bothering the Mashiach about Koresh? But we see there's a connection here. So the Rashi says, Mashiach nimshach k'may shem amishcha. What's Mashiach mean? The one who is anointed, with the oil of anointing. Koy b'lani lacha, v'hachi kamer. This is what he says. Koy amar shem l'mashichai. L'koyresh. Okay, I want to bring up the verse over here, because this is actually, for those who are Baal Koira, this is interesting. Okay, so here is this Yeshaya Parak 45. In Yeshaya 45 it says, Koi Amar Hashem l'Mashiachai l'Koresh. So said God to the Mashiach Koresh. So the Gemara says initially it thinks to say that he's calling Koresh the Mashiach. So he says, no, he's talking to the Mashiach about Koresh. Now Rashi is going to show us something very interesting. Generally the rule is we don't analyze the notes. The notes meaning the tunes of the Torah or the prophets. If you look over here, if you could see this page over here, you'll see that there's notes. This little L-looking shape under the mem is a note. On top of God's name is a note. And on top of Mashiach is a note. These two notes are not typical. This little S, sideways S, called a zarka, is not typical. After the Hashem's name should be a segel. That's usually how it goes. These two notes to come together are not regular. And Rashi says the notes that are like this means to say that Koyam Hashem stop, Koyam Hashem l'Mashiachai stop, the Koresh is separate. Meaning to say that the Mashiach and Koresh don't go together. If you read it, Koyam Hashem l'Mashiachai the Koresh, then it says, so said God about the Mashiach Koresh. But if you put a stop in between, so said God to Mashiach about Koresh. And Rashi understands this from the way the notes are going. And because the notes are not typical, means to say that there's a divide. Very rarely do we analyze the notes, because we just try to, if we can understand the letters, we're okay. The notes are much more complicated. Okay. So here Rashi says, he held his right hand. Who yivnes basi? He's going to build my house. Trei krochsiv. The samche adodi v'nikud tam mikra zeh moichiach al drosh zeh. He says it's not possible to have the zarka, the S, without having a segel afterwards, because they go in. The notes go into each other. It says Koyam Hashem l'Mashiach, and both of them are zarka. V'lekoresh doesn't have the segel. La Frisha is coming to tell you that it's a separation. The Mashiach is not Koresh. God's speaking to Koresh, to the Mashiach about Koresh. Why was God upset? God was upset at Koresh, disappointed in Koresh, because he gives a permission for the Jews to build, but God wanted him to build it. It's amazing. Imagine, because this is deep stuff about the tradition of what we have about Mashiach. First of all, we have Migdash Ad Nekon Yedecha. We have a clear verse that says God is going to build the third temple, or the final temple. And here God is, and even David wasn't able to build a temple, right? Shlomo had to build a temple. And here God expects the Gentiles to build a temple on the Temple Mount. And that's what he wanted from Koresh, and Koresh doesn't do it. He gives permission for the Jews to build it, but he wanted that, and he connects it to the Mashiach. He has a conversation with the Mashiach about the fact that Koresh doesn't do what he should have done. The Gentiles should have built the second temple. It says, according to Rav Nachman, Bar Rav Chizda, his interpretation, God said to the Mashiach, I am complaining with regard to Cyrus. For if he had acted accordingly, the second temple would have been built differently and will not have been destroyed. There wouldn't have been the last exile, the one we're in right now, and the coming of the Mashiach would have been sooner. So says the Chidush Yehudis Rashbi. It's not anyone saying this. This is Rabbi Shimon ben Aderet, one of the Talmud Rabbi Yonah, a Rishon, the great Rashbi says that God expected Koresh the Gentile to build a temple. Had he built a temple, there would never have been the second destruction. There never would have been the exile, and the Mashiach would have come sooner. I'm assuming those words sooner means to say that Koresh is not the Mashiach, but Koresh would have hastened in the days of the Mashiach. So here, Rav Steinsaltz says that Rashi is quoting a verse that doesn't say in the pasuk. The verse appears with different wording later in Isaiah. He will build my cities and my exiles. It doesn't say bias. This is the text quoted by Rashi, and it appears to be the correct wording of the verse. Means Rashi has Rashi saying that God didn't expect him to build Jerusalem. He expected him to build a temple. The verse says to build Jerusalem. Okay, we have 5 minutes. Let's just go a little further. The Gemara goes back to analyzing the Megillah further. It says in the Megillah, Chel paras umadai hapartimim. So the Megillah says in Esther 1:3, we're getting slowly through Esther, right? So we got through Esther 1, we got through Esther 2, Esther chapter 1, verse 2. The verse continues, the armies of Persia and Media, which is the Medes, and the nobles, hapartimim of the nobles. Uchsiv l'mache modei pares. Sometimes at the end it says, 10 to the kings of the Medes and the Persians. So which one is it? Is it the kings of the armies of Persia comes first, or do the Medes come first? Sometimes the Medes come first, sometimes the Persians come first. So Amar Rava says that asnuye asnu ba'adadeh, they made a t'nai, they made an agreement. Yiminan malche, if means there wasn't a disagreement. The Medes and the Persians were together; they became like a single people. That he said, "Yiminan malchai, if we make a king, minaychu iparche, v'minaychu malchai minar iparche." Basically, if we appoint king, which is the highest position, then the second position is going to be the nobles will be from the other country, the other peoples. If the Medes are kings, then the Persians are going to be the nobles. Kind of a balance of power, right? We have today the Senate and the Congress. So not to have only one kingdom to have all the power. So if one is king, the other ones are the nobles. If one is the nobles, the other ones are the king. Chsiv paras umadei haparsimim samach laparsimim eitz l'madei v'chsiv madei paras samach malchei eitz l'madei. Sometimes we see that the kings are from Persia. Sometimes we're seeing the kings of the Medes. Although the Persian Empire began with Cyrus's decisive victory over the Median Empire, in truth, Cyrus brought about a situation in which there were two nations sharing the throne. He appointed Medes to prominent positions in the country, even among the ranks of the highest authorities. Status from the period include soldiers from the king of Persia lined up in pairs, one Persian and one Median. So they shared kind of rule. Let's do one more verse. So it says that he wanted to show in his meal his great wealth and his kingship. Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, Rabbi Yossi the son of Chanina says, "Melamed shalavish bigdei kahuna." So the Gemara tells us that Achashveirosh wore the high priest clothing in this big meal. Because we see the idea of Tiferes, beautiful, is connected to the garments of the high priest, meaning to teach us that what does it mean that he wore Yikar Tiferes Gedula to show his great beauty? That we're not talking about his beautiful stam, it's talking about the beauty of the garments of the Kohen God. So it says, Big Day Kahuna Shahayu Biyadei Sham Big Day Kohen God L'Shavim Yishlayim. They brought the garments of the high priest from Jerusalem, and he wore them at the meal. Like I said, the Kliyakar says he did that because he thought that by doing that, he wouldn't have an ayin hara in his meal. He wanted to avoid having an evil eye by his meal. The Megillah continues, in these days, so it's Esther 1 now, we're holding Esther 1:5. So just to remind ourselves exactly for a second. So first we have Achashveirosh. B'yamahem he sits on his throne. In the third year of his kingship, he makes the meal, the armies of Paras and Madai, and the ministers, to show his great wealth. And then it says, when these days were over, so he made two meals, right? He made the meal for everyone, for the 127 nations, and then he made a meal for the Persians in Shushan, in the capital. By the way, don't think it's insignificant. We're going to see soon that the Gemara is going to go into analyzing how the meal was and where the meal was. It's not by chance this whole controversy of building a ballroom right next to the White House. This is already an issue that came up by Achashveirosh, figuring out what kind of ballroom you have and what kind of suit you have. These are again old issues that happened around the time of Achashveirosh. We see them happening now. Rav and Shmuel, again, the two colleagues, they disagree. Chad Amar Melech Pika Chaya, Bechad Amar Melech Tipa Chaya. They can never agree. Was Achashveirosh a smart king or a foolish king? Man Amar Melech Pika, the one that says he was a smart king. Hayishaper of the car of Rivkah Bereisha. It made sense first to make a meal for the people from a distance, means those nations that lived far, all the way 127 nations. Dibnei Moshe call Amos the boy Mefaislu. That he says, why? He says because he was a clever king, that he acted well when he first brought close the more distant, as he could appease the residents of his own city whenever he wished. Right? He doesn't have to appease his own residents of the capital right away. The boy Mefaislu, Umanda Amr Tipashai, the one who says he was a fool, the boy Lekroive B'nei Maseh Breishi should have first make an allegiance with the people next to him, the Imaru Hanich, because maybe they're going to rebel against him from a distance, and he's going to have no allies because he's out there trying to make peace agreements with countries, but his own party is against him. First, establish your close-knit group, the people next to you, and then you could go out there and start making peace agreements with other countries. Then the people, if the further countries, right? It's very hard for a president to try to threaten or make deals with foreign countries when the people in Washington are not agreeing with what he's doing. First, to make alliances with your party next to you. So then when you try to have foreign policy, your foreign policy has a base. You can't hurt the base. So that's why they say it was foolish. Now, from here we see, we're going to stop over here. The ones who said he was smart, that he had a meal for the distance. It's not that Rav and Shmuel are arguing if he was a fool or if he was smart. The point is that everything about Achashveirosh was questionable. He had both very smart things about him and at the same time very foolish things about him. The question is, what are we emphasizing? Again, this is something that we're dealing with now. There's a lot of genius, at the same time there's a lot of foolishness. And together we're trying to figure out what comes from a place of foolishness of Achashveirosh and what comes from a place of cleverness of Achashveirosh. All right, so it just gives us a little insight, kind of perspective. So we're not to think that things just happen the way they are. They happened before many years ago too. Laila Tov, everyone, and have a wonderful week.